The weather is unreasonable and uncomfortable and insufferable, and I can think of a whole lot of other words too. So we want to stay healthy. Hey, listen, along that vein, no 5 o'clock prayer. It will be at its hottest at that point, and I really don't want you out if you don't have to be out because it is a health issue, so let's be careful. Pray at home for sure, and I know that you do. Continue to pray. We've got a 40 days of prayer and fasting we'll begin talking about next week, and the focus will be revival in our nation. How many know we need revival in our nation? And we're going to be explaining exactly what we mean by that, and revival in our own lives too. So look forward to that, but pray at home today and be safe, okay? Some people have a serious problem with God's grace. And the people that I have in mind are God's people. It's not the outsiders, it's the insiders that have a problem with God's lavish grace. Let me explain to you what I mean by that, by grace. It is always lavish. It's over the top. God's grace is always more than we ever deserved or could have imagined. But by grace, what I mean is God's favor. He shows you his favor. And it's unearned. It's not based on your performance or my performance. It's based on Jesus' performance. And he chooses to be very lavish in his grace. And what that means on a practical level is his grace is very uneven from our perspective. And the people of God sometimes can look at somebody who's on the receiving end of God's good grace, his unearned favor. He's just plain good to them. And he may be good to them financially or health-wise or relationship-wise, or he may gift them in a way that's remarkable. And sometimes we can be tempted to look at that, God's unearned favor in another life, and be put off by it. That's what I mean by some people have a problem with God's lavish grace. His grace is his unearned favor that he shows us every day. Let me describe those people for you. People that have a problem with God's grace, they look at some other believer that God is blessing, maybe in an extraordinary way, probably in a way that he hasn't blessed them, or to a degree he hasn't blessed them. And as they look at that person, they don't like it. Why is God so good to them? Doesn't he know what they've done or where they've come from or what they act like when nobody's looking? Other people don't know what I know. Why is God being so nice to them? Or why is he being nicer to them than I perceive he's being nicer to me along a certain line? Maybe he has blessed them financially. We don't like it. Maybe he has blessed their family. Maybe he has gotten them out of a difficult situation. And we feel like they don't deserve it. Well, that's your own business. But that's the people that think that way. And there are a lot of believers like that, have a real problem with God's lavish grace. We're going to look at some believers like that today. John 8 is where you want to be in your Bible or your Smart Kid app. I want you to turn there. We're going to look at a passage today that blows away those that have a problem with God's grace in other people's lives. We're going to look at a story that blows that completely away. Blows their self-righteousness out of the water. But it does other things. Now there are a couple of phrases in here of note in John chapter 8. We're talking about those funny phrases. What I say about them is it's intentional. There's intentionality behind some of these strange phrases. It's deliberate strangeness. There are things in the Bible that I've got a feeling God made them sound deliberately strange. And he does it on purpose. There are different phrases that we've looked at, like eyes of the heart and go the extra mile and pearl before swine and writing on the wall. And there are a whole bunch of them. We're not going to get to all of them. But there are a bunch of them. And I got a feeling that they're deliberately strange. And the two that are in this story today, deliberately strange, so that we will look at them, not just pass by them, but look at them and say, what? What are you telling me? What do you mean fly in the ointment? What do you mean salt of the earth? They're deliberately strange, and there are two of them in this story today that are deliberately strange. It wraps up with a phrase. Our passage is John chapter 8, first 11 verses. It wraps up in verse 11 with Jesus speaking, saying, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." Very interesting phrase, deliberately strange phrase. It's a phrase of pardon. And the usual way that we look at this story, and you that are Bible readers, you already know it's the story of the men who bring the woman caught in adultery. The usual way we read this story and think about it is just that. Those liberating words that wreck those stone throwers. Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. And the focus is on their self-righteousness and on Jesus' pardon for the woman. But let me give you a new and different way to think about John 8 for the next few moments. Kind of an expanded way of seeing this story. Jesus is never doing just one thing after all. And there's another phrase in here that I want us to pay more attention to. He that is without sin, let him cast the first stone. That second phrase is what we'll zero in on, we'll drill down on. Pick the story up in John chapter 8, the first verse, but really there's a story behind the story. You could have guessed that. It doesn't start here on this day when they bring the woman. It starts a lot earlier than that. It starts some days before. Jesus is quizzed by his brothers about why he's not going up to the feast. This particular feast is a feast called the Feast of Booths. It's one of the three principal feasts that all good Jews try and get back to Jerusalem for every year. Sometimes called the Feast of Tabernacles because it reminds them, it's a reminder of how God took such good care of them while they were wandering in the desert before they had temporary shelters is what they lived in for 40 long years. And so part of the celebration, it sounds odd to our ears, but Orthodox Jews still do it today. During this feast, they gather in Jerusalem or other places, and they don't live in their normal apartment or house. They live in a makeshift shelter for a week. They literally build a shelter. In this day, they would travel to Jerusalem, and if they were strangers to Jerusalem, they would find a vacant lot or next to a building, and they'd put up a lean-to, and that's where they'd live for the week. If they were homeowners in Jerusalem, they would do the same thing. They wouldn't go inside. They would go outside the house, and they would build a shack of sorts. Feast of Booths. And his brothers come to him, and they say, "How come you're not going up to the Feast of Booths?" Everybody is, you know. Now, we know his brothers. We even know their names, Joseph and Jude and James and Simon. They don't really have Jesus figured out. In fact, they think he might be a little bit loony. Something's not quite right with Jesus. And they say that on several occasions, and they've come to him now, and he's pretty much stayed out of Jerusalem for a while. He's unwilling to go there because there's some people that want to kill him. He knows that. So for that reason, he's not going right now to the Feast of Booths. But his brothers give him a hard time about it. We know his brothers, again. We even know them by name. And two of them at least become believers when they see Jesus rise from the dead. Maybe they all do, but we know that two of them do, because two of his brothers, James and Jude, write books that become part of your New Testament. They're at the end of it. James and Jude are his half-brothers who become believers and pillars in the church later on. But at this point, they're giving Jesus a rough time. And they say, "How come you're not going up to the feast like everybody else, like you normally do? Why don't you go up and proclaim yourself publicly? You want to be a public figure? You've got a message? Well, this is an opportune time because the city is full. Thousands of people, tens of thousands, maybe over 100,000 visitors have crowded into the city. and it's jam-packed with people living in these little hovels all over the place. This would be a great time, Jesus, to go up and show yourself to the world. They didn't believe in him. They were really mocking him at this point. Jesus says, my time hasn't arrived. That's why I'm not going up right now. And so he doesn't. Now he will eventually get to the feast, but he's there for only about half of it. He doesn't go up when everybody else goes. When he does go, he goes secretly. He goes secretly because there's a lot of discussion about him, and some of it is hostile. And every time Jesus talks, the question among the intelligentsia is, the elites want to know, how did this guy get so smart? He's not a trained rabbi. He's just a traveling teacher. He's never been educated. How is it that he speaks with such wisdom? And how is it that he speaks with such authority? And a lot of people have a lot of opinions about him. Some people think that maybe he's anointed by God to do this. Maybe he's some kind of prophet. Maybe he's a prophet risen from the dead. Maybe he's John the Baptist risen from the dead. Maybe he's the Christ. Some people think he could be Messiah. Other people think he's a remarkable teacher. There's a lot of opinions, and some people think he's doing it because he's crazy, or maybe he's motivated by the devil. So a lot of opinions. Jesus finally sneaks into the city. And he tells them when they confront him, they finally spot him, the authorities do. And their real pick with him is that a few weeks before, he has healed a man on the Sabbath day. And that has greatly offended them and caused them to send out a death squad. He's healed a man who was paralyzed, who was waiting and had waited for years by the pool that the people, the locals, said every once in a while at a certain time of the day, you had to be really careful and sharp to catch it, but an angel would stir the water. That's what they believed. And when that water began to stir, if you were first in, you would be healed of whatever your problem was. But this guy could never be first in because he was paralyzed. When Jesus asked him if he wanted to be healed, his excuse was, I can't get in first. Somebody always shoves in front of me. And so Jesus, a few weeks before this feast, had miraculously healed the man. He'd chosen to do it on the Sabbath day, and that offended all of the religious leaders. And so when he finally does sneak into town and he finally is detected, they begin to harass him and trouble him. He was speaking publicly to the people, and that irritated them too. Some of the people were saying, don't the rulers know this could be the Messiah? And when the people began to voice that, and that story went around, it really disturbed the authorities, and they sent out those soldiers to arrest him on the spot. He was in the temple every day, the few days that he was there for the feast. When the crowds were there, he would take advantage and he would go into the temple. And when you hear temple in the New Testament, it's not a building per se. There is a temple building. It's beautiful. It's overlaid in gold. It's stunning to look at, especially when the sun sets or rises. But it's more than just one building. It's a complex of buildings, and they're huge plazas, and there are open spaces and courtyards where hundreds and hundreds, even thousands of people, even tens of thousands of people can gather. And when they do gather there, especially for feasts, it's a noisy affair. It's a raucous time. It's loud. There's singing. There's chanting. There's cheering. It's almost like they're teams at a soccer stadium. The roar just never stops. No time is that more true than at the Feast of Booths. This was the one you went to if you could go to anything. So Jesus goes every day into the temple complex, and he's teaching hundreds and hundreds of people. And they're amazed at his teaching. And the authorities are trying to get hold of him, but he seems to every time slip away into the crowd, and they can't get him. And the chief priests and the religious leaders, they tell these officers, on your life, we want you to get this man. We're tired of his message. He's causing all kind of dissension. Finally, he says one day, I'm going to a place, he tells the leaders, because the leaders never confront him themselves. They always send somebody else, but he spots them in the crowd and he says, I want to let you know that very soon I'm going to a place that you're not going to be able to get me. What's he talking about? And now the speculation does go crazy. Where does this man intend to go that we can't find him? Is he going to leave Israel? Is he going to go to the Jews that are dispersed all over the known world? What's he going to do? Where's he going? And then he does it. This feast was a high water mark in everybody's year and everybody's life. And if you could manage to be there on the last day of the feast, that was the day. Because this feast, as I said, it commemorated that time that they wandered in the wilderness and they had been led by a column of fire at night and a column of smoke in the daytime. And so there in the temple plaza, they had erected these giant torches that towered over the whole crowd. And on the last day, the evening of the last day, after the sun had gone down, they would send down priests. Outside the walls, there were steps that led to a spring, a natural spring, and they would fill it. They would fill these pitchers, golden pitchers, with that spring water. And remembering how they were taken care of, fed, clothed, and how they received water miraculously in the desert, in the waste place, in the chaos place. For 40 years, the high priest would take that golden pitcher and they would drench the altar with it. And when they did, those two huge torches, they were fed, they were power fed. We think ancient people were primitive. They weren't. They knew how to make a torch that was a torch, and they had oil going into it, and they would ignite that thing at just that moment that the water splashed over the altar, and the things would explode. And they would illuminate that entire tens of thousands of people in that plaza, but most especially it would illuminate the backdrop of the golden temple. And it was dazzling, and the crowd would erupt in an earth-shattering roar. That's what happened on the last day, the great day. And the people would cheer, and the people would chant, and it was a great day. And the Bible says on the last day of the feast, on the great day of the feast, Jesus stood and he cried out and he said, if anybody is thirsty, let him come to me and drink, and I will give freely the water of life. And the crowd is mesmerized, and the leaders are defeated. They are as angry as they've ever been. And they send those officers, there he is, get him, snatch him, stop him. Jesus slips away again, and when those officers come back to the chief priests and they're quizzed, where is he? Why didn't you bring him in? They said, we couldn't touch him. We've never heard anybody speak like this man. There's debate among these rulers now because the rumors are flying about who he is and where he's going to show up next. And they can't seem to get their greasy hands on him. And so there's a discussion among them. And they say to the officers that should have brought him back, that also have been amazed by his teaching, are you going to believe him too? Are you going to be like the ignorant crowd that doesn't know the law, that doesn't know the word like we know the word? Are you going to be like them too? Are you going to believe him too? Nobody of us has believed. None of the rulers have believed. None of the high priests have believed. That's because we're smart. We're in the know. That crowd is ignorant, and they're cursed. But one of their number, one of the elite, one of the rulers, named Nicodemus, the rabbi in Israel, the authority, Nicodemus was a secret follower of Jesus. He'd come to him for a nighttime interview some months before. And he'd begun to follow Jesus. He just didn't want his fellow elite to know it. And he spoke up in this discussion. Nicodemus, who had come to Jesus by night and was one of the followers secretly, he reminded all of those elite leaders, you can't do this. Our law, our instruction, our tradition is that we cannot judge a man unless we first hear from him and know what he's doing. And you're going to judge him and execute him without proper steps. And they said to him, are you from Galilee too? Jesus, the prophet, the rabbi, the Christ, is from Galilee. Only ignorant people come from Galilee, these people thought, and so they harassed Nicodemus. Are you a Galilean, maybe? No prophet comes from Galilee. And everybody went home then after the feast. But Jesus went up to the Mount of Olives. That was one of his favorite places. We're coming to our story now. The story of how some people have a serious problem with God's lavish grace. And early the next morning, he came back into the temple, and there were still a lot of people around, and he sat down and he began to talk to them. And as he's talking to them, and as they're being amazed, and they've never heard anybody speak like this, everything is interrupted when those religious leaders bring a woman. They've harnessed her, they've got her, maybe they have her bound up. But they drag her in, and they set her in the very center of the action of the court where Jesus and who knows how many people are listening. They interrupt everything that's going on. And they throw the woman to the ground and they say to him, Teacher, Rabbi, this woman was caught in the very act of adultery. And then they remind him of what he already knows. That in the law, in the instruction, that's what that word law means. In the law of Moses, the Torah, the first 5 books, it's very clear in that instruction that we were commanded to stone people like this woman. And that is true. That is very true. Blasphemy, kidnapping, witchcraft, incest, homosexual behavior, and adultery are all stoning offenses. You pay for your life. What is stoning? A group of people, a mob gathers around you, puts you in a pit, and they pick up rocks and throw them at you, and not little rocks. But it's almost a contest to see who wins the prize by bashing your skull open with a large rock. And they continue to rain those rocks on you until you're dead, until your ribs are crushed and you breathe your last and your skull is smashed. That's what stoning is, and adultery is an act that will get you that. In the law of Moses, we're commanded to stone such women. What do you say? That's their question to Jesus. What do you say? And they're implying and they're saying implicitly to him, you know as well as we do what should be done here. But say it out loud. Say it. They were saying this to test him, partly, so that then they could accuse him if he made a false move or misinterpreted or was too lenient. He didn't say anything. He went to his knees, he got on the ground, and he began to write something in the ground. We don't know what he was doing, but he wasn't paying attention to them, and he wasn't answering their question. What do you say? He didn't say anything. But they persist in asking him, come on, what do you say? Where do you stand? Tell us what your opinion is. How do you interpret this? What should we do with this woman? What would you do with this woman? They keep badgering him until he straightens up and he says to them, he who is without sin among you, let him be the first to cast the stone. And then he stooped down and kept writing. No more interaction. But he didn't need to say anything else, because the account tells us when they heard him say that, he that's without sin, let him be the first to cast the stone. When they heard that, they began to leave that very public place. They exited one by one. Oddly enough, they went out in birth order. The older ones went out first, followed by the younger, until he was left alone there with the woman. The crowd is still watching, but they're some distance removed, and it's just Jesus and her, and she's still on the ground, and he's standing beside her. In the very center of the action, it says. And Jesus, he stands up, and he says, Woman, where are they? Where are the ones that condemn you? Where are your accusers now? Does no one condemn you? The only answer available to her, since they're all gone, is nobody condemns me, Lord. Not now. And Jesus said, I don't condemn you either. Go and sin no more. You know, this is a strange story to me. And as I work through it, there's so much that I didn't expect to see. Think about it. Jesus makes no judgment on those would-be stone throwers, and he makes no judgment on their motives. He doesn't question their heart. He does that in other places. He will say to people, why are you reasoning like this in your heart? But he doesn't do that here. He makes no judgment on them. He never tells them that they've misread the law. He never course corrects them. He never says to them, you're wrong. He never questions their civic duty. And it was their civic duty. What they were doing was perfectly legal and expected. And had they not done what they were doing, they would have been called into question. He never questions their credentials as morality police. He never condones her behavior either, yet he doesn't condemn her. And he still doesn't question the law. He doesn't condemn the accusers. You see that? He only asks, where are they? Where did they go? This is very unexpected, this story. Now, we typically read it and think about it, preach it one way. I want to give you a different way to think about it today. He's saying to them, you all say that you're right. Your proposition, she should be stoned. You're all saying as a group that we're right in saying she should be stoned. And he says, okay. Just make sure first. Just make sure that the first thrower knows that he's right and there's nothing wrong with him. That's all. And what did they do? They dropped the stones and leave. Something happens here. Something happens, and the stone throwers don't throw anything. It's a rare thing that's happened here. It's very rare among humans what happens here. And it floors me to see it in the story. We see people before our very eyes that change. They change their thinking. That changes their behavior. And that's very rare. But it wasn't the group that changed. Groups don't do anything. It's each person that changed. They changed, and they walked away a better person. You see that? Now, whether adultery is a crime to us is not the issue. And neither is their smug attitude, their self-righteousness. That's not the issue, although that's usually the way we present it. But think about it. Think about it. They are acting on what they believe and what everybody in the community believes. That adultery is a stonable offense. It's a capital offense. It's an offense against our community. And this is how we deal with it. Everybody believed that. It was their civic duty. It was their religious duty. In this, they were normal. And they knew it. And the text of Scripture backed up their position. But look at what they do. They throw it all aside. They abandon it all. They abandon it all. And they change. So let's pick it apart for a minute. What's going on? One thing that's going on is Jesus sent them into their own minds. You see what he does here? He sends them into their own minds. They come as a group, almost a mob. But he sends them into their own individual minds. They went to a place that many people never go. They examined their own thinking. You know, the single biggest obstacle that you face in trying to change something that you want to change about yourself, the single biggest obstacle that you face isn't a lack of money. It's not a lack of education. It's not because of where you grew up. It's not because of your social standing. It's not because you could have had better influences or better parents or nicer bosses. The biggest obstacle you face is never examining your own mind. And he forces them to do that with his question, "He that's without sin among you, let him be the first to cast a stone at her." They had to go inside. He sent them to their own minds. He helped them overcome that obstacle. It's never easy examining your own mind. What they were doing is examining their mind, and they were realizing that they're a kingdom of one. Each individual person is a kingdom of one. You are a kingdom of one. And the question is, how well are you ruling your kingdom? Are you allowing foreign influences into your kingdom? Things that don't belong there. It's possible. It's possible to live for decades and decades and never know yourself. A lot of people do it. I think that's why so many people avoid Jesus, because he will take you to your own mind. He will send you to your own mind. He will force you to look at yourself. Jesus sent them into their own minds. And then the other thing this story is telling us is that solo acts are all there is. I noticed that they go out one by one, and they're finally all gone, and Jesus says, "Where are your accusers?" And she said, "I don't have any," because they all went home. They weren't on the premises any longer. And I noticed that there was no discussion among them, the stone throwers. They didn't poll each other and get a point of view from each other. They didn't vote on what are we going to do here. This group didn't walk away. Each person walked away. That's why I said earlier, groups don't do anything. It's individuals. We want to credit or blame groups. We want to credit or blame a political party or a union or the media or all the criminals or all the doctors or all the teachers or all the generations. A whole generation failed us. We want to credit or blame the police, a group, but groups don't do anything. Individuals do these things. And because of Jesus' question, each one of these people was brought to order their own kingdom. Their kingdom was disordered. Their thinking was wrong. And when he sends them into their own minds, they act as an individual. And each comes out changing the order of his kingdom. Each ended up ruling well, and each threw out disorder in their kingdom. By hearing Jesus, each of them declared independence from all the other influences. And this is the course I will take. And they changed. What you do matters. What you do matters. Think about the judgment hall of Pilate. And as Jesus, beaten and bloody, stands before him, they've tried their best to humiliate him. As I've told you before, nobody expected to see a Messiah with spit on his face, but there he was. And the contrast between the majesty of this emissary of imperial Rome and the rabbi from Nazareth, broken in front of him, humiliated, could not have been greater. And Pilate's got a dilemma. What will I do with Jesus, who's called the Christ? And that's a question for you too. What will you individually do with Jesus, who's called Christ? And then finally, it's telling us that only Jesus can take you where you need to go. He's the only one that can do that. Each one of these men, these would-be stone throwers, they walked away better people, didn't they? They were changed, and they were changed for the better. They walked away better people, and Jesus did that for them with a simple question, and he can make you better. He can make you better. Those fits that you throw that you wish you didn't throw, he can deal with that. He can make you better. The stinginess, the secret sin that nobody knows about, he can make you better. The hidden prejudice that you would never speak out loud, but it's there, and when you see somebody, you say, there's one of those people. He can help you with that. That sense of entitlement, that pride. Those wounds that you like to nurse. You're almost glad you got hurt so that you can pretend you're better than somebody else. The jealousies, the envies, the too harsh words that come too easily. He can take you where you need to go. You see? This is a rare thing, change, but it can happen. When with Jesus' help you face yourself. Now the question is, will he make you feel better when you face yourself? Not necessarily. And I think this is another reason that people keep Jesus at arm's length, because when he shows you something about yourself, it feels bad. And I don't like it. Will he make you feel better? Not always. Maybe not. But he will make you better. And those are two different things. I want to wrap up with a verse. I've told you before, when you have one of those days where you feel like you can't connect with God, that prayer seems like nonsense. It's just self-talk. And as the old preachers used to say, the heavens are brass and you can't get through. And when you try and open the Word and it's just gobbledygook on a page, you know what I'm talking about. We go through those times. Go to Romans 8. You'll find something in Romans 8. And there's a phrase in Romans 8, verse 29. For those God foreknew. In other words, before you entered the planet, before you discovered America, before you were born, before you even a twinkle in your daddy's eye, he knew you. And he knew you intimately well. He foreknew you. For those whom God foreknew. And who is that exactly? Oh, just every single person that's ever lived. God foreknew. For those that God foreknew, He also predestined. We talk a lot about predestination. Or some predestined, they're designed to be saved, and others are designed to be lost. There are people that think that. And there's about a 500-year discussion about that. And you can pick sides all around in that if you want. I choose not. But there are people that lock in on that word, predestined. For those God foreknew, which is everybody, He also predestined everybody. To what? To be saved? No. It's bigger than that. It's grander than that. God's plan for you is more than that. It's more than just a trip to the altar. It's more than just signing a confession card or praying the sinner's prayer or saying, I am a Christian. It's way more than that. What did God predestine you for? I'm only reading it. I didn't write it. For those whom God foreknew, which is everybody, He also predestined to be conformed to the image of His Son. What is God's desire for you? It's that you would look like Jesus. That's what He predestined you for. Not for lost or saved. He's not willing that any should perish. But His fondest desire and hope for you is that you would look like Jesus, His Son. And in fact, you are a daughter and son. And so you're on the path. He predestined to be conformed to the image of His Son. Here's the Father's interest. That He might be Jesus, the firstborn among many, many, many brothers and sisters. You're a sister, you're a brother to Jesus Christ. You're included in the circle, you're in the family. That's household talk, you see. For those God foreknew, He also predestined to be conformed to the image of His Son. He will change you, and it won't be a better image of yourself. It won't be a best version of you. When He gets done changing you, you will look like Jesus Christ. There will be a strong family resemblance between you and Jesus. Now, there are two messages here, and I'll wrap it up with this, that may address two very different needs and very different kind of people that might be hearing this. There are two messages. One is a message for the person who says, I need to change. There's something in me that's wrong. Maybe that list that I rattled off a moment ago, prejudices, entitlement, pride, secret sin. Maybe there's something along that line. Maybe it's a totally different thing, but there's something you need to change. An attitude, a stance, the way you treat somebody or a certain somebody. It's got to change. It's got to change. Maybe a grudge. Maybe a lack of generosity. It could be straight up prejudice. Got to change. And you know it. But you're powerless to change it. It may be an addiction. It may be a chemical dependency. It may be a spending thing. It may be a pornography thing. But it's got to change if you're going to be a follower of Jesus. If you're going to be in the family. Got to change. And so maybe somebody is here today and says, yeah, that's it. I need to change. But maybe somebody else is here today and says, I'm at the bottom. I need to hear Him say, neither do I condemn you. Because I feel condemned. I feel like everybody's finger points at me. And maybe for good reason. Maybe I am bad. But I need to hear Him say, neither do I condemn you. Well, the good news is, provision has been made for both. He can change you from the inside out. When we approach Him and we confess and we say, I need your help, we call it repenting. When we do that, and I urge you to do it every day, I urge you to start every prayer session, short or long, with repenting. Clear the deck. Get it out of the way so you'll be drawn into prayer. And prayer won't be so hard. Start with repenting. Repenting is simply this. It's allowing Him to change you. It's a change. It's a change in your thinking, in your heart, and in your habits. And when you truly repent, it's the work of the Holy Spirit to bring that change about. Whether you need to hear Him say, I don't condemn you, it's the same route, or you need to change something in you that affects those around you, it's the same. Why don't we stand together? And before we take off and do our dead level best to stay cool the rest of the day,